I am joined by Neil J. Young, writer and author of Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right. Before we jump into the discussion, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. The pleasure's all ours. So I wanted to get into the things you discussed in the book, starting with what is the first marker in history for the movement of quote unquote the gay Republican, LGBTQ Republicans? When do you discuss this movement kind of beginning within the Republican Party?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the beginning point of what would be a visible, recognizable movement of gay Republicans happens in like 1977, 1978. And it begins here in California, where I live, because there was a ballot initiative called Proposition 6, or what was more commonly known as the Briggs Initiative. It was put forward by this conservative state legislator from Orange County, California, named John Briggs. And it went on the 1978 ballot. And had it passed, it would have made it illegal for any gay or lesbian person to work in California's public school system. And so when that ballot initiative got proposed, dozens of gay Republicans, mostly in San Francisco, but also in the Los Angeles area, started coming out of the closet. They started organizing and they created these grassroots organizations to defeat the Briggs Initiative and also to show the Republican Party that, hey, we belong to your party. We're already Republicans, and to push back on this, at the time, this very early stage of the religious right.
So yeah, you spoke about Proposition 6, and that's good because I did want to ask you if you could go into maybe if there's any others, or you could go more into that of some of these laws that were weaponized against the LGBTQ community at the time. I know it's probably mostly the like homosexual community. Like in what ways were these laws used to target them?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because California was building on something that happened in South Florida, in Miami. In the mid 1970s, a bunch of mostly like liberal cities had begun passing these non-discrimination ordinances that included, for the first time ever, sexual orientation. And most of this was going sort of under the radar because it was happening in places like Ann Arbor, Michigan, and liberal university towns. But Miami-Dade County was one of the locations that passed a non-discrimination bill. And Anita Bryant, who was this far-right conservative gospel singer, she'd been a beauty pageant queen. She lived in Miami and she became aware of what had happened there through her pastor. And so she launched this campaign to have it overturned. And it was called Save Our Children because this idea was that, children were under threat from homosexuals. And that was successful in Miami. And it was the first moment in which, and that happened in 1977, where there was this real sort of recognition that anti-gay politics could actually do pretty well in the nation. Anita Bryant became, hugely important in conservative politics because of what she accomplished in Miami. And John Briggs in California said, I'm gonna, repeat that here in the state of California. This was obviously the beginning of a sort of anti-gay political backlash that was really working against the sort of progress that had been going on for the last decade of a growing gay rights movement. And you see this sort of escalate in the 1980s and really become a sort of strategy at the national level with, Reagan Republicans, obviously the Reagan White House, and sort of the National Republican Party through the 1980s.
I think that not much has changed in that regard then, because you still
No,
hear a lot of, they're going after the children and these kinds of
right.
things used in the political sphere today. I think another figure who is probably, at least to my belief, would be important to kind of things around this time would be J. Edgar Hoover. Could you kind of speak to him in relation to the movement around this period?
Yeah, so J. Edgar Hoover's sort of a much more important figure a little bit earlier on. I mean, really sort of in the mid 20th century. Obviously, I think probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with him, the role that he played in really cracking down on homosexuals during the mid 20th century. In this era of the Cold War, a lot of historians refer to it as the lavender scare, because the federal government was dedicating so much of its power to finding homosexuals, first in the State Department, right? There was this idea that homosexuals, like communists, had infiltrated their way into the federal government and that they were a threat to the nation. And J. Edgar Hoover, heading up the FBI, was committed to this work. Now, of course, most historians believe that he was a closeted homosexual himself. And so there's a sort of interesting psychology at work there. Like, is this guy a self-loathing homosexual who is giving all this political effort to ruining other homosexuals' lives because of his own tortured, self? Like, historians have weighed in on that. But I think what's really important to understand is the way in which he was part of an enormous apparatus, and really an enormous federal project directed at gay and lesbians in mid-century America. I mean, people were thousands and thousands of homosexuals were arrested, had their lives ruined in the 1950s and 1960s because of these fears about the lavender scare and this idea that homosexuals were the greatest deviants in the nation. And because they were deviants, they were the most likely to turn into communist and to betray their country. And I think it's important to know that it wasn't just straight politicians who were creating this political scare, but there were homosexuals that were involved in it as well, such as Hoover.
And not to, I guess, discount lesbians or how this could have affected women as well, but
Yeah,
something I've noticed is a lot of times the focus is directed towards men, at least in the rhetoric kind of things, which I think you can draw parallels to even today, especially with like attacks on trans women and these kinds of things, where it's like a constant debate around masculinity and how people don't like when it feels threatened. Could you kind of speak to how that is in relation to the movement back then?
absolutely. I think that's such a smart observation and a really important question because so in the 1950s, this idea was that again, America was under attack from, from communist Russia, and that the US had to be the strongest nation in the world in order to defeat communism and to protect itself. And so notions of masculinity are tied up in these ideas about state and national power, right? You can't have weak men, and what's weaker than a homosexual? So there's that stuff that's going on. But in terms of like men are much more sort of subjected to this than, or gay men are much more subjected to this than lesbian women. I mean, partly it's because gay men tended to live a little bit more visible lives. So they were more likely to go to gay bars. They were more likely to meet one another for sex in parks or public restrooms. They just were much more vulnerable in their visibility, and so they were easier to target by federal officials and also local law enforcement. But again, I think your point is really important here that this idea of weak men and effeminate men was perceived as a threat to the nation, even as they also imagined the homosexual as this sexual predator, right? Who is going to, go after children and all that. And we can draw a straight line, as you suggested, to recent panics around groomers, right? And the don't say gay bill stuff. This idea of like, again, I think it's more that men represent a threat to children in the classroom because they're going to groom them into homosexuality or now into like gender dysphoria. And also the threat of trans women in athletic sports.
And obviously around that time, I guess in the 60s specifically, there was sort of like a cultural shift going on with the rise of like many social movements from like the civil rights movement, feminism. So I'm sure heading into the 70s or even
Yeah.
the 80s, there was a feeling of backlash about how oppressive or repressive, I guess I should say, they were around this time. Could you speak to kind of like, because I'm curious, was the movement able to grow at these times, or were they still kind of facing the pushback even despite the rise of other social movements?
The movement being the movement of gay Republicans or
Yes,
the
yes.
LGBT? Okay, yeah. I mean, so I think that's a really important point. Like the 1960s are obviously this decade of, huge cultural transformation, like changing gender relations, changing social norms, changing race relations. And really, I think a lot of historians look at the 70s and 80s as a backlash to a lot of that sort of progressive change. You know, you have a resurgence of conservatism, particularly of social and cultural conservatism, and the way that those political actors sort of harness the Republican Party to really sort of push back on the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. The Republican, or rather the gay Republican movement, is really interesting because it's trying to sort of walk a fine line here, right? Like they define themselves mostly as libertarians, which is important to remember. There used to be a pretty healthy libertarian wing of the Republican Party at one point. And so most of these guys are, they're like, I'm small government conservatives. I want I want the federal government to stay out of my wallet, stay out of my business, and stay out of my bedroom. And in the late 70s, they really believe that they represent the true Republican philosophy. But what they don't really understand is the tidal wave that they're about to, get, sort of completely overwhelmed by, which is the rush of social conservatives and what we would refer to as the religious right coming together as a political force and moving into the Republican Party and taking it over in the 1980s. And so it was really interesting to look at a lot of these gay Republican clubs that began in the late 1970s and the documents, like their newsletters and their meeting notes from those first meetings they were holding in the late 1970s. And they're saying to themselves, like, who are these Bible beaters who are trying to come into our Republican Party and take it over? And from the perspective of 1977, 1978, it makes a lot of sense. But for what we know of what really takes place in the 80s and the 90s, they were just caught really unaware of sort of where history was headed, and especially where the Republican Party was headed, and how much the religious right was able to capture the party in the 1980s. They're completely unprepared for that development.
And I'm sure that that kind of is what started more of the more reactionary responses or elements that we saw in the response from Republicans. I mean, everyone, I'm sure the Democrats didn't really have a home for them either at this time,
Right,
too, which I could understand maybe they had more libertarian beliefs in terms of, just let them stay out of our way.
right.
But I was wondering if you could go into some of these kind of reactionary elements we were seeing at the time. I know a big one that a lot of people point to is Ronald Reagan saying like HIV is God's will and that kind of thing. But I'm also curious if there were any others, and maybe the role that that played in shaping the GOP to what we know it as today.
Yeah, so the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s is enormous here, and really it shapes, I think, all of the reactionary politics that does develop, especially on the right in the 80s and leading into the 1990s. Um, Reagan famously doesn't ever say HIV or AIDS until his second administration. And actually, it's really late into the presidency. I think it's 1987 when he first even says it. So he's almost done as president. By then, thousands and thousands of Americans have died, and many, many more have contracted the disease. But what's really developing on the right, and Reagan, I think historians have rightly criticized the sort of lack of response from the president himself. But one of the things that I show, and I think some other historians have shown, is actually it could have been a lot worse because the people he had working in his administration, such as Patrick Buchanan, um, and a couple of others, are these crazy right wingers, crazy homophobes, and the memos that they're drawing up in the White House of what they want the president to do are awful. So everything from, we should have a national database that names every homosexual in the country and we should track them and keep, and some of the proposals they should be quarantined, or they should get tattoos. Like really awful stuff is being debated within the White House. Reagan doesn't take any of these things up, so I guess it could have been a lot worse. But I think all of that speaks to a really, really anti-gay, really homophobic politics that is taking shape in the 1980s that goes into the 1990s. And then we see that shaping things like, military policy around, keeping the gay ban in place, and other sort of vicious, really homophobic politics that I think really characterizes the Republican Party of the 1990s.
And the next question I want to ask might be relatable to this, maybe a little less so. I am admittedly less familiar with it. I wanted to ask about log cabin Republicans.
Yeah.
What were their beliefs? Who were they, and then what was their position in relation to the gay Republican movement?
Yeah, great question. So, Log Cabin Republicans is the nation's oldest and largest gay Republican organization, although not the only one, but the one that I really focus my book on because it's the most important. So, those grassroots clubs that I was telling you about that form in the late 1970s, mostly here in California, those are actually the sort of grassroots groups that ultimately come together in 1990 to form the national organization known as Log Cabin Republicans. And these grassroots groups have names like Log Cabin Club of Los Angeles or Log Cabin of San Diego. The group in San Francisco was actually called Concerned Republicans for Individual Rights. But these local chapters at the city level in California, and then they start to grow across the nation in the 80s. They ultimately unite in 1990 to become Log Cabin Republicans. Now, Log Cabin Republicans all along existed to do a couple of things. The primary thing it existed to was to push back at the homophobia within the Republican Party, to say, listen, again, we belong to this party. We're good Republicans. They worked hard, especially in the 90s and the 2000s, to support more moderate or even progressive Republicans around, gay rights or LGBTQ rights, to try and defeat the sort of far right wing of the party, to move things forward around, especially around HIV funding. I mean, Log Cabin Republicans did a lot, especially when George W. Bush was president, to get that administration to give a lot of money to HIV funding, research, and prevention, um, and also to support things like the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was the military ban, of course, on gay and lesbian service persons, and to support the movement for same-sex marriage. And as I show in my book, Log Cabin Republicans are fundamental to what I think are the two biggest civil rights achievements of the LGBTQ rights movement of the last half century, which is ending the military ban and the legalization of same-sex marriage. Log cabin Republicans and gay Republicans more generally play a huge role in both those developments.
And you spoke to it a couple times throughout this interview, whether it be the log cabin Republicans in California or even some of the politicians that were trying to take, policies from other states and move them in
Yeah,
California. So I wanted to ask about California's role in the movement in kind of legitimizing gay Republicans, not even just from that time period, but even up to the passing of, I think, Proposition 8. I think it was in
right.
2008.
Yes, exactly. So California was such an interesting place for this history to develop because in so many ways, California, there's that expression, as California goes, so goes the nation. This idea that California is the most important state, it's the largest state. What happens there eventually is what will happen across the nation. And gay Republicans in California were making that argument over and over again. In large part, they were making that argument to the California Republican leadership, which, particularly in a lot of these decades, Republicans were not doing well in California anymore. And so gay Republicans were going to the California GOP and they were saying, listen, let's not run these far right, Bible beater types. Let's run people like us, like social moderates or even social progressives, fiscal conservatives, because we're the type of candidates and we're the type of public image for Republicans in California that like moderate voters, suburban voters will gravitate towards. So that was the argument they were making in California, and they were successful to some extent with that. But what I think and what I show in the book is that sort of argument doesn't play out on the national level. Because if anything, Republicans in the South and the Midwest are saying, we don't want to become California. We don't want to become even the California version of the Republican Party. And so even as they continue to make this argument, like we represent sort of the better face of republicanism, and we represent the sort of image that's going to be more attractive with American voters. Social conservatives have completely taken over the Republican Party in the 1990s, and they're like, nope, we're not doing that, right? We're going to double down on social conservatism. And so, it's sort of an ongoing argument they have. But I think what's really important here, and you didn't ask about Trump, but I'm going to bring us up to Trump, is that I think the real disappointing and even devastating development for log cabin Republicans, and I think for gay Republicans in general, or LGBTQ conservatives, is they have collapsed, like everything else on the Republican right, into full-scale Trumpism.
Yeah.
And although this organization existed for decades as a sort of thorn in the side of the Republican Party, right? We're going to call you out on what's wrong. We're going to hold your feet to the fire and make you be a better party. In the age of Trump, they have completely signed on to full-scale Trumpism, and they are, thick as thieves with Trump and the sort of Trumpist direction of the party, just like every other organization, every other demographic of republicanism. And I think for them, it's a particularly sad turn from their history, and it really, I think, a betrayal of what they once were.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you got there before I could, because I did want to get to today for this next question, kind of. And I think that Trumpism could be sort of to blame, I guess, for the more reactionary parts of it, with politicians like Ron DeSantis comes to mind with the "Don't Say Gay" law and this kind of things, and with the normalization of even more anti-LGBTQ rhetoric than has been in, I guess, recent years, probably more so akin to back in like the 80s and such, like we were
Yes.
speaking of. What do you think of this moment in the history, I guess, of the movement? What do you think it speaks to that we're kind of back at this point now?
Yeah, I think it's a huge question. It's really the moment that we're in, right? The way in which the sort of anti-trans politics, especially in the 2022 midterms. And I think even we're seeing in this election, particularly in certain states, is like at the forefront of Republican strategy for winning. Um, and I think, the thing that my book shows really in the sort of last chapter of it, because I was finishing up the book right when the 2022 midterm elections were taking place, was I think the difference here is the way in which gay Republicans and log cabin Republicans have actually accommodated a lot of this anti-trans development. Now, they argue that especially log cabin Republicans, says they support trans rights and by that they mean any adult should be able to live any way they want to. And they say what they oppose are what they call the radical gender ideology being forced on the nation's children. And I think that that's a position that actually a lot of Americans align with. I mean, if you look at polling around this issue, it becomes sort of complicated in terms of like, what do we mean when we're talking about trans rights? But the thing that I asked a lot of the and I interviewed nearly 3 dozen gay Republicans for this book, including the current president of Log Cabin Republicans, who at the time was being incredibly supportive and working closely with Governor DeSantis in Florida around the Don't Say Gay bill. And I said, are you concerned at all where this is heading? A lot of people think that this is not a distinct piece of legislation, which is only about, kindergarten through third graders, which it was the way the law was written at the time. It's now been expanded through 12th graders. And also it served as a blueprint for other states to do much more expansive things. But I said, are you not at all concerned where this might be headed? And all of them said, oh, no, no, of course not. Marriage, same-sex marriage is the law of the land. It will never be overturned. None of these other things will happen. And I think that that is a naive position. I mean, we'll see. I don't know. I'm a historian. I examine the past. I don't forecast the future.
Not a psychic,
But
right?
right. But I do think it's a legitimate question to ask, where's this headed? And are you at all concerned that you have helped some of these politicians who might have a much bigger assault on LGBTQ rights planned for the future? They don't see that as a concern, but I think, um, especially if Trump wins this election, um, it's a big open question of where the broader assault on LGBTQ rights is headed.
So I have one quick, I guess, follow-up question to end on then, just because it was kind of surprising to me that you said that the log cabin Republicans were even working or in communication with Ron DeSantis
Yeah.
with the Don't Say Gay bill. Is there any time, I guess, in the history of the movement where this group you think has worked against their own self-interest, or like, worked with someone who seemingly doesn't have their best interests in mind with laws like this? Or is this something that's novel to kind of the Trumpism wing of the Republican Party now?
It's a good question because I think you could argue on one hand, well, every Republican presidential candidate that they supported from 1980 until, 2016, who had some, degree of opposing same-sex marriage or any other handful of LGBTQ rights or gay rights as they would have been known for most of this period, that yeah, that's sort of akin to working with DeSantis now. I think the DeSantis connection is a bit more pointed than some of those other examples because I think in the past, the Republican Party platform would be very anti-LGBTQ, but a lot of gay Republicans would reassure themselves that, like, well, Reagan doesn't really believe that, or Dole doesn't really believe that, or George W. Bush doesn't really believe that. And to some extent, I think they were right. Ron DeSantis really believes these things, and he's really doing those things. And so it's a sort of partnership that I think fits within that history, but also stands out as a bit unique too in terms of how clear he is as a political leader around these issues. I will say that log cabin Republicans has become a bit more critical of DeSantis recently, but I think there's two reasons for that. One is he's no longer a national candidate, right? He didn't win the nomination this go around. So I think it's easier to be critical of a guy whose political history seems probably done, right? He's a second term Florida governor. He probably will never run for president. Who knows? And also because he is expanding those laws. And I think it's starting to become a little bit more, um, it's becoming clear on the ground in Florida what the overall agenda is. And so they're starting to push back there. But again, I feel like they should have been aware of where it was all headed from the start.
Yeah, I agree. I think with the way his national stock went like this from this
That's right.
campaign, that he probably won't run again, but you never know. I guess, can't put anything past him. But I do want to, again, I want to thank you for taking time to speak with us. I'll have a link in the description to the book if anyone wants to check it out and learn more about the history. It's Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right. And Neil, again, just thank you so much for sharing with us some of your knowledge.
Thanks for having me, and this was a wonderful conversation. I'm glad we got to cover so much ground.
Yes, yeah, me too. It was amazing. So likewise, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I don't want to hold you for too long.
Take care.